using these system or these constant variables, please do that. This kind of gives us an open forum to discuss these two particular types. Okay, first off, I want to talk about system variables. What is a system variable? Basically, very simple. It's going to be a type of an internal variable. Okay, these are going to be parameter values that are passed to the ByDesign configurator engine that can be retrieved during execution time. What we call characteristics of a system variable, they're going to be a variable name that begin with a prefix of I-. So again, I said this is a type of an internal variable. The values of a system variable are defined at the time the ByDesign configurator is called, and the user will not be able to change these values. So when the value is passed in, we'll use date as an example. It's going to pass in a system date. It's going to tell you that, hey, you're ordering this on March 10th, 2010. Okay, that's just a reference. You're not going to be able to change that. All right, the next screen is just screenshots from Design Studio. These are all of the system variables that are available to the ByDesign configurator. There's roughly 75 system variables that we have defined. Now, do want to make a note that not all these system variables are going to be available to you to use. Okay? The reason it's going to be based on your calling system, your host system. For example, we are embedded in MacPack. These variables are available to, all these variables are available to an embedded MacPack user. Whereas a NAV or a Sightline 8, they're going to have a subset of these. All of these variables would not be available. Okay, if you do see something here that you would want to use, if you're in one of those systems that we do not pass this value to you, we could actually create queries and redefine these system variables to look up that value at the time. All right, I just want to run through, look at a couple of ones that are used more often, okay, so we can understand them. The first two I want to talk about is what we call the system user ID or the system group ID. Okay, the user or group IDs are what's going to be associated to your host system login ID. So for me, when I log into one of the ERP systems as C Baltimore, okay, behind the scenes, I may have a different user ID or a different group ID that's assigned to my name. That user ID or group ID for the configurator will get passed in this system user ID or system group ID and be accessible by the rules for me to control the rule execution. So let's look at the group ID for example. I have CS manager, customer support managers. Okay, I'm in order entry. In my order entry, a regular order entry clerk would have maybe a subset of questions to answer. And then a manager would have to review that order and approve it, adding additional information. Using the group ID, I can control the rules and filter out questions that an order entry clerk versus a CS manager would have to answer. All right, the next two is our system config mode and system config type. All right, the system config type, or excuse me, mode, is going to let me know the execution mode of the ByDesign configurator. We have two execution modes, interactive and implicit. An interactive configuration is one that I'm going to see the questions and I'm going to answer them. Click continue, it'll bring up the next question, I'll answer that, move to the next one. An implicit configuration is what also we call a silent configuration. It's one that gets ran behind the scenes. I'll have a part number and then I'll have a list of variable names and variable values that I would pass to the configurator. And then behind the scenes, it would process and validate the variable names and the values. And if it's correct, return a completion code to my host system. All right, I also gave you an example of what an expression would look like using the system config mode. Here I have I-sys config mode, equals constant config mode active. Okay, it lets me know that I'm running that interactive configuration. The next one on the list is my system config type. Okay, we have three different config types. We have initial configuration, or sometimes called first configuration. The second one is reconfiguration. And then the last one is validate or validation mode. Okay, the initial configuration is when I select a part and select configure and I answer the questions for the first time. A reconfiguration, I would use that or be in that mode when I go back into an existing line and may need to make changes. The user decides that they're buying a particular door. They give me the dimensions. They say they want a 30-inch wide door. Well, they come back and say, hey, I need to change that. So if I go back into the line, I'm reconfiguring it. Validate and validation, okay, that is actually used with the ByDesign channel cells when I'm importing orders from one system to the other. I can run a validation. Okay, it's going to run an implicit, which is behind the scenes, configuration mode. It's telling me that the type is validation, and it's just validating that the values are correct. All right, one of the reasons I might use config type is when I'm setting dynamic defaults. Right, I answer a question. Based on that question's answer, it pre-selects the value of the next question. Well, in an initial configuration, I would want that. In a reconfiguration, I may not, because the user on that second question may have changed the value. So I want to suppress that dynamic default because I want to use the user selected. So if you look at my expression I have written there, the sys config type equals the constant config type reconfig. I'm doing an evaluation, a true-false statement there. Do I want to execute a particular rule if I'm in reconfiguration mode? All right, the next system variable would be system source type. Okay, sorry guys, I have a little bit of a typo here. This is actually going to, instead of being interactive and implicit, this is going to let me know if I'm doing a sales order or a quote order. Okay, so ignore the 2 bullet points right there. This is going to let me know where am I calling the configurator from. Because I may want to ask questions differently between a sales order mode and a quote mode. In a quote mode, I may want to ask just the basic questions, to get a ship date, get a price. Whereas in a sales order mode, I want to get additional detail about building out the product because they want that product now. They've got the estimate, now I want it. All right, the next 2 system variables I'd like to look at is system current component sequence and system cur part. All right, the current component sequence is going to allow me to look up the current configured component sequence, okay, to understand how my rules are going to be processed. So let's use the example of an entry door system. The entry door system is what I sell, but it's actually comprised of 2 configured items, a door frame and a door. Okay, the entry door system would have a current component sequence of 1. The first configured component I called, which would be the frame, would have a component sequence of 2, and then when I call the door, it would have a component sequence of 3. The reason for using this is if the parent configured item calling the child configured item are both the same part number. The ByDesign configurator allows you to do this, but I may need to ask the questions differently. So for example, I manufacture windows. And if the window, the configuration, matches a in-stock item, I want to add that as the component of the manufacturer.